So the first and biggest matchup of the game is obviously the quarterback aspect, and both quarterbacks are bona fide studs. But I'm riding with Lamar here because despite having worse weapons throughout the year, Lamar posted a 7 better quarterback rating, just 4 less total yards, 3 more touchdowns, and a PFF grade that was 6 points higher than what CJ Stroud posted. Shifting to the offensive line side of things, this is really going to be an interesting matchup because Baltimore has the offensive line to neutralize the great pass rush of the Texans, with Morgan Moses being the watcher of Will Anderson and Ronnie Stanley being the blocker for Derek Barnett and Jonathan Grenard. They're going to struggle to have some rushing success, though, because Baltimore ranks third in rushing expected points added, but they're facing an elite run defense in Houston, who ranked first in rushing success rate. So any success they're going to have is going to be really earned by the Ravens, because even if the Texans looked a little bit incompetent defending the run against the Colts, or a lot of bit incompetent for the first 3 quarters, they ended up figuring out how to stop the Colts, and that's something they've done throughout this season. Is they've figured out how to stop every rushing attack they've faced. Something that would worry me if I was a Ravens fan is the Ravens receivers against the Texans defensive backs, because though the receiving core for the Ravens is much improved from what it has been in years past, it's still not perfect. And really, the Texans have an elite corner trio. So though Zay Flowers and Odell Beckham Jr. are really solid targets, I'd rather have every Houston corner over every Baltimore receiver, because Derek Stingley is just elite and Steven Nelson is very solid. So I think the Texans have the matchup advantage in the receiving versus defensive back department against the Ravens. So that's one thing to watch out for, is how are the Ravens going to get consistent offense, because it's going to be hard to rush the ball, and it's also going to be really difficult to pass against this vaunted Texans defense. Shifting to the other side of the ball, there's a lot of give and take for the Baltimore defensive backs, as Brandon Stevens has the physicality and just straight up physical matchup to go against Nico Collins, as he only gives up a couple inches on Collins, whereas most cornerbacks give up about half of a foot in height against him. So that's going to be difficult for Collins, because he's used to just bodying whoever he goes against. And Stevens also is roughly as fast as Collins, as he ran nearly identical 40 time as Collins did. So that's really nice. But the Ravens are going to be without Marlon Humphrey, which is a pretty big loss. Humphrey didn't have as great of a year this year, according to PFF grade, as he has in years past, but he was still very solid and is definitely an above average corner at the very least. So there are some causes for concerns for the Ravens defense as well, because you're going to be down your best corner probably, and you're going against a passing offense that's led by CJ Stroud. Just for perspective too, Nico Collins was the 3rd graded PFF wide receiver in the league this season, and Brandon Stevens was the 44th best corner. So he's really solid as a defensive back, but the talent gap is still pretty large. But after that initial matchup, I think the Ravens are pretty solid in their regards of defending the Texans. Surprisingly enough, the Noah Brown loss is actually pretty large for the Texans, because he was really having a solid season. He was averaging about 57 yards a game and was clearly the number 2 option when Tank Dell went down. So that's just another receiving option for the Texans that's going to be missed. John Mechie was somebody I was kind of high on coming out of Alabama, but he is not really produced in the NFL to this point, which is not all his fault. He had a bout with cancer very early on in his career and has not really had too many chances to thrive in the league so far. But it'll be interesting to see who's able to produce for the Texans because, again, Nico Collins should have success against his matchup, but Robert Woods is going to have a difficult time being defended by Arthur Marlette and Kyle Hamilton. And John Mechie is going to have his work cut out for him as well because really Ronald Darby is a very solid number 2 in the absence of Marlon Humphrey. So there is still some talent on the defensive back sides of things for the Ravens. It's going to be interesting to see which injured side does better. I'm expecting the Ravens to have the edge because they just have less of a numbers injury at this point, where the Texans are down 2 guys, the Ravens are down 1 key guy. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Moving to the defensive line now for the Ravens, Baltimore should have success pressuring Stroud. The interior offensive line for Houston is a bit weak, and Travis Jones plus Justin Madubuike should be able to have success against them. Really, the interior, aside from Shaq Mason, is really a weakness for the Texans. So I could really see Stroud having difficulty being able to climb the pocket, which is really going to make his life miserable because he's not going to be able to buy time like he would like to. And Jadeveon Clowney and Odafe Owe are both good edge defenders that they can pressure on Stroud as well, even with Fant and Tunsil being good offensive tackles as well. So there is going to be some pressure on Stroud, and it's going to be interesting to see how he does against that because he did well against the Browns' pressure, but the Browns were not covering worth a dang against the Texans. So it'll be interesting to see how he does just being challenged incrementally more difficultly than he was last week, as the Ravens, they have the ability to get pressure on you, but they're also going to be covering more nicely than the Browns were last week. Looking at the offensive line more holistically, the Texans ranked 19th in PFF pass blocking grade compared to Baltimore ranking 7th in PFF's pressure grades. So there should be a pretty clear distinction between the Ravens rushing and the Texans pass protection. And as far as the run defense is concerned for the Ravens, it's going to be a stoppable force meeting a movable object because Houston finished 26th in rush EPA, which stands for expected points added. I have a video describing that stat if you need more information on it. And Baltimore ranked 22nd in rushing success rate allowed, which just is every play that is basically better than expected based on historical data. So this is going to be a tough matchup to really see any sort of consistent success because the Texans don't have a good run game and the Ravens don't have a good run stuffing agenda to them either. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. In the end, though, I think the Ravens should win, but I don't fully buy into them being favored by as much as they are because the last I saw it was 9.5 points. Some places I'm sure are at 10, which is a kind of key distinction in my eyes. I think maybe you do see 9.5, but 10, that's really expecting a lot. Either way, though, the numbers are high, and I don't fully buy into it because I think CJ Stroud is really hard to bet against, and the odds are stacked against him because he's without his number 2 wide receiver in Tank Dell. There are some other injuries for the Texans as well, but they aren't nearly as key as being without your second wide receiver. And I think this number is just so large that it kind of discredits just how good the Texans defense is as well, because they're not going to be a pushover against the Ravens offense. And as I've signaled throughout the video, there's some good matchups to be had on both sides of the ball for the Texans. So I would not buy into this number at all as a Ravens bettor. I think that it's just simply too high for a team that's going to be playing competitively with house money in the Texans. So that's my opinion on it. If you disagree, you can let me know. I'd be interested to see why you think that number is going to be covered.